The entire occipital lobe is a visual processing center. Vision for primates is our super sense, if you will. A lot of species you could single out a sense that is particularly acute. For us, it is definitely vision. As such, roughly a quarter of cortex is devoted to vision processing in one way or another. So let's talk about vision, and then we'll talk about the occipital lobe more broadly. So here we have the eye, cornea, lens, but most important to us is the retina. The retina lines the very back of the eye and is organized as such. You have your photoreceptive cells and your cones and rods. Cones process color vision, red, green, blue, selectively sensitive cones, and rods process uh, brightness and black and white, grayscale. You can see the cellular organization with horizontal cells, bipolar cells, these amacrine cells. But let's pick up with the ganglion cells because it is the axons of these ganglion cells that make up our optic nerve. Before we move on to that scale, uh, even though it's slightly surprising, light is coming in this way. Light actually passes through all of these cell layers, stimulates, and then the signal comes. And as I said, the axons make up the optic nerve. Now let's look at how vision is processed from the retina on. Now, the back of your eye is a dish. The uh, outer portion of the retina is called the temporal, and then the inner portion is called the nasal. Here, the L and the R are indicating the left visual field and the right visual field. And I drew in which segment of the retina perceives which area of the visual field. Now, if we follow, you see that the temporal uh, portion of the left eye comes this way and remains in the left hemisphere. Whereas the nasal portion of the left retina, look at what it does. It crosses. This is the optic chiasm or optic crossing. But note, only the nasal portions of the retina cross. The temporal portions remain on that side. Now you could do little mental exercises, and you should work through these to see what you would see out of each eye, the left eye and the right eye, if you had selective lesions at this point, in this direction here, here. D is also relevant, and I added this one here. Don't worry about this, or for our purposes, just worry about A through D and this new example. Work through this. Should we do one together? Okay, let's do mine. Let's say you had a tear of the left temporal bundle, what would you lose? Well, that area of the retina receives signal from this portion of the left visual field, the medial left visual field, and the rest is okay. So, what would this person's vision be like? They would have lost vision in the nasal portion of the left eye. B is very easy. If you tear the entire optic nerve coming from the right eye, you lose the right eye. But just as an exercise, work through these and make sure it all makes sense to you. Now, this is a more detailed view of the occipital lobe. And here's a mid sagittal slice, and we're looking at the medial wall. What you see is that the naming scheme, there's a lot of V. So this is vision, station 1, V2, V3, 3A, 4, 5, and so on. Did they leave? Yeah. Um, One thing I want to note is this is the calcarine fissure. And you see that the cortex surrounding it is V1. V1, also known as the primary visual cortex, also known as striate cortex. The way vision works is much like a production line, like our phones were produced on a production line. At station A, maybe we had just the shell of our phone and that was put together. Then it was sent over to station B, where maybe the motherboard is inserted. And then that goes to station C, and you get the drift. Vision is processed much this way. It's an iterative process. Now, much like this is a far cry from a phone, the information in V1 is a far, far cry from this beautiful vision that we have conscious awareness of. Basic edges and areas of high contrast are detectable at V1. And as you go through, the cells become more and more responsive to more and more complex features. And then pretty soon, you start to have attentional modulation of cortical activity. That's just a fancy way of saying if you want to pay attention to a particular person walking around in a crowd, okay, you will modulate activity in these areas through that selective attention. Prior to that, it's more automatic. Whatever hits the retina will project back to V1, although that is being debated and there's some evidence of attention modulation even here. But there's strong evidence of attention modulation later on. At V5, for example, we finally can detect objects in motion, directionality, momentum, the vector. Once the occipital is done processing the visual information, we're still nowhere near our final really rich visual experience. What happens after the occipital is completed? The visual pathway or the production line splits into two. We have, it's labeled here, but I just want to make it more clear. We have the dorsal stream, and we have the ventral stream. This is aka the where pathway, and this is aka the what pathway. And where's the dorsal stream going? This is a portion of the parietal. Now, the more anterior portions of the parietal process touch. Here in the more superior portion, we process spatial aspects of vision. Here, you don't have a sense, there's no information about what you're seeing. Rather, it's about where you are with respect to the object, how big it is it moving, how far away is it? Sorry if I'm repeating myself, but those spatial components of vision, mostly non conscious. And through this feedback, we also can modify our body posture. So there's lots of use of this information. But remember, these are the spatial aspects. Now, down here, going into the inferior temporal, to the inferior temporal cortex, is where we begin to now identify features of what we're seeing and reflect them back to what we know. Is it a face? Is it a vegetable? Do I know this? Is this threatening? Is this a stimulus that I have a bad history with? Okay, so recognizing the content of the visual information, so the what. Now we just started in on the temporal lobe, but in the next video, we'll spend more time on the temporal lobe.